The enemy was inside the building, a structure weakened by the suffering inflicted by artillery during the long months of battle. The exhausted Ukrainians walked through the rubble of Bakhmut. The rifles were aimed at the windows, with their attention shifting between the risk of a surprise attack or tripping over the remains of the city and becoming an easy victim. Their training showed when, without exchanging a word, the man in front opened the door. The second man went through the funnel of death, firing into the room, knowing how easy and open a view anyone hiding inside would have. The next shot swept across the field. The Russian brutally showed that the Ukrainians would not get in there. Attempts to make him surrender would be useless, and his next response would be even more brutal. Just another day in Bakhmut, one of the last for the Ukrainian troops in the urban area of the city. The months of fighting for Bakhmut were witnessed by the whole world. The battle generated immense repercussions in the conflict videos through increasingly painful reports and the unpredictable and irrational speeches of the leader of the Wagner group. Those were times of hatred and sadness, when the end of winter did nothing to warm the hearts of any soldier lost in the hell of the city's ruins or in the muddy trenches nearby, even as the green returned to the fields. Plants grew wrapping around the bodies of men who had fallen long ago and been forgotten in no man's land. Their disappearance into soil fertilized by blood would be a cruel and faint hope for the families who, without their bodies to mourn, would forever hold on to the expectation of seeing them again. The Russians advanced over one of these green fields in April of 2023. The Wagner group intended to encircle the city, making life impossible for the Ukrainians. A hard advance was made when the mercenaries pushed forward with full force over Kromov. The strategy was basic, to put an end once and for all to the supply route the Ukrainians had along the road. The mercenaries' usual method relied on mechanized support, which allowed for a furious advance against the Ukrainian trenches. The BMPs dropped soldiers right next to the enemy positions. The soft grass was used to throw themselves onto, seeking protection. The Ukrainians who ducked into the trench found themselves surrounded. They were forced to fire while the Russians were right in front of them. A new wave came through the tree line, closing the perimeter tighter and tighter. Cornered, the Ukrainians fell one after another. The fall of Kromov was bitter news that made the hearts of soldiers inside and around Bakhmut beat at different rhythms. The Russians smiled as they watched from the hills the rain of artillery on the city, knowing that now it was only a matter of time before the ammunition ran out and the urban area became a mass grave for the enemy troops. Inside, the Ukrainians looked at each other with concern, knowing that now all they could do was survive and trust their comrades outside. The offensive to save the brave men among the rubble of buildings and houses began when two plans were made. The first was to retake the road of life. The second was to create routes to allow the men to leave the great cemetery that Bakhmut had become. Different Ukrainian troops were northwest of the city. They set a goal to retake Hill 190 at the bend of the road of life. It was from there that the Russians were shelling the supply routes and the reserve troops' path. It was hell to pass through the place that was now becoming the road of death. The Ukrainians knew that the hill could not have the white, blue, and red flag flying over its top. Their hearts closed to fear when the orders were given to retake it. The squad that moved through the trenches was not the first to step into the mud of those holes, saturated with the inherent sorrow of war. The land was fertilized with violence, and the men were aware that they were part of it in one way or another. The soldiers that day were not using the typical AKs, which were a trademark of the battles in the region. Armed with Modułowy system broni strzeleckiej Grot caliber 5.56, they walked hunched through the trench, often seeing how close the Russians were. The Ruchnaya granata degtyarewa, 5 grenades exploded on the ground, warming the air of a cold evening. One of the soldiers provided cover for the second, who crawled over weapons and belongings of men who had been left behind, both their material possessions and their bodies in that war. He threw the grenade, clearing the way for the heavy advance of the Ukrainians who were waiting for the right moment. Advancing through the trench required patience. Many times the path was quick, with a dynamic that was fundamental to the soldiers' survival. On other occasions, it was necessary to stop and have the patience to wait for the enemy. They waited crouched during tense moments, often with their feet brushing against the bodies of enemies, or with their eyes trying to avoid the cold faces of comrades who had died in previous attacks. The smoke from the grenades gradually mixed with the air they breathed as they tried to control their breathing. Waiting was essential. The trench was the devil's trap on earth, meant to steal the lives of more and more soldiers. Every corner was the shadow of the devil lurking with a wicked smile at the corner of his lips. The small squad of mercenaries that advanced forgot about this. That was their end, falling over the trench. And he was still saved by his own friend's body, which absorbed most of the swords. Wounded and screaming, he dragged himself through the ditch. The mercenary leader heard the cries for help and noticed how the men with him were shaken. He moved forward, pushing his men until he reached the crossroads. There he raised his AK and terminated the man's contract. The Ukrainians watched in shock, unable to tell if it was friendly fire or the cold-blooded ruthlessness of a leader. Even so, the devil didn't ask for the mercenary's soul that day. The man was still calling for help, the green of his uniform increasingly stained with red. His leader called for a truce so everyone could retrieve their wounded and dead. The bloodied soldier crawled through the trench behind him as he negotiated. The Ukrainians agreed and started talking among themselves. The distraction almost cost them their lives when the mercenary threw the grenade and hurriedly retreated through the trench. The retreat of Exonesto, however, did not serve to save the lives of all the Russians. Many of them were trapped in their shelters as the Ukrainians advanced. The hideouts were dangerous to take. A single well-protected individual could easily avoid the fire from several men and injure them as soon as they advanced. The Ukrainians needed to be cautious, using grenades to finish the problem. Sometimes they were necessary to clear the way while the soldiers made dangerous turns until they found a position to finally aim their weapons and end the problem. Retaking Hill 190 was a relief. On May 11th, the 92A Mechanized Brigade had directly attacked the central point of the Russian defenses. The 200th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces was pushed back without receiving support from the flanks, who were undecided about whom they should help. The 30th Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade took advantage of the situation to continue the offensive on May 12th. The lack of support forced the regular Russian troops to retreat from kilometers that had been gained at the cost of much blood. The Ukrainians stopped over the columns, watching with relief as the mission was accomplished. But they still hadn't finished the final plan for the city that month. They watched from their trenches as their brothers inside the rubble suffered under Russian artillery. It depended on a series of actions from them and another coordinated campaign in the south for everything to work out. The mercenary leader had talked a lot, threatened, cursed at the Russians and Ukrainians, pointed fingers and showed his fallen fighters, blaming the government's bureaucracy. He had names ready on his tongue whose image he continuously tarnished with promises proven by blood. The Ukrainians listened to the complaints about the lack of ammunition, about the withdrawal of mercenaries, and saw how the bombs kept blowing up their hideouts, taking away their lives, sanity, and hope. The show served the tension that the Russians, or the mercenary leader himself, seemed to want over Bakhmut for reasons that would be discussed by media outlets that constantly accused each other. Inside the city, the mercenaries were getting ready. All that was left for the Ukrainians was the citadel and a few other defensible positions. The apartment complexes were the Ukrainians' chance for protection against the increasingly dense Russian forces. The artillery was hell on a daily basis. And the situation in the city proved that all the talk from the mercenary leader was just a show. The soldiers tried to hold their positions in small groups when they got trapped in houses or buildings. How bad? They sheltered their squad. Sometimes, while waiting for support, they were surprised by the destruction that came from the sky. The Focke-Wulfs brought death and panic upon the men, forcing them to retreat, often in a disorganized way, which ruined their leaders' plans. There was no shortage of soldiers cursing the mercenary leader's words about there being no ammunition. There was plenty, and the bodies he showed were only the result of his strategy and his thirst to conquer Bakhmut. The world focused on him, while the lives of soldiers were taken inside one of the largest cemeteries ever built by man. The Ukrainians tried to fight back. Simply waiting for the enemy was like sitting in your own grave and waiting for the walls to collapse on you for a burial without dignity. They advanced, searching every building. The fighting was so close that the conversations between the soldiers became a disconcerting factor. The Russian didn't want to leave the place. Even surrounded, he prepared himself with his last magazines and grenades. A distraction from the Ukrainians was enough to throw an explosive that collapsed the squad's preparation. The Russians were trying to corner these men. They were often seen on the other side of the street, and the soldiers counterattacked with grenade launchers, trying to keep their spirits up. The smiles faded when others appeared in yet another wave of attack, trying to suppress them. There were so many mercenaries that often elite men prepared to kill would appear, as well as those who understood little about their job. At a certain moment, a pair of mercenaries was suppressing the Ukrainians. One of them tried to throw a grenade at the enemies over 100 meters away. It exploded and did little except draw someone's attention. It's not known how, whether by friendly fire or another Ukrainian squad, but someone opened fire on the mercenaries, ending their work. The Ukrainians that those two had attacked could breathe a little easier, but there wasn't much they could do. Night was falling, and inside the buildings they heard the devil calling with roars in the form of explosions. There was little time to think about the wounded who hadn't been evacuated, or the bodies that they might never be able to recover from the rubble. These were somber and sad moments that preceded the end. It was necessary to cut off thoughts about the cost of so much battle that was now beginning to come to an end. The brutality of the Russian advances increased when the paratrooper troops left the flanks of Bakhmut and joined the rear of the Wagner group. The elite reinforcements came with the support of heavy tanks that now roamed freely through the city, blowing up everything that moved. Going past the windows was like waving for a premature visit to your ancestors. T-90s roamed the streets of Bakhmut heading toward the citadel. A basic strategy from Russian tactics books was put into practice, combined with what the mercenaries had already been using successfully. The defenses were attacked directly in the middle. The mortars demolished homes that had once been the dreams of families. Each of those rooms was turned into a tomb for the Ukrainians. The fire lit up in the middle of the concrete. The defenders began their withdrawal, watched by the mercenaries and the paratroopers. The music played in favor of the Russians, and the orchestra, as the Wagner group liked to call themselves, had its musicians in tune during those days of combat. The mercenaries advanced, began to dig trenches, buried their ammunition there, and prepared the way for the next wave. As soon as one of the defenses was breached, all the force gathered in the previous lines poured through the gap. Ukrainian elite troops tried to hold back the advance, while other less trained groups began to escape. The citadel was falling, and thus one of the main fortresses in the city now had the Russian flag raised over apartments filled with Ukrainian blood and the bodies of brave men. Those still alive moved on to the last sectors. Domino would be one of the last alternatives for the Ukrainians' survival. The Wagner group had already understood the Ukrainian strategy. In their bases, the mercenaries looked at maps and showed which paths the Ukrainians would take. Their opponents were retreating, and their desperation in the last attacks was to regain these escape routes. They had retaken the north, where the lower-level troops had retreated. But without the south, their elite men would be massacred inside the city. Those who were still in Bakhmut watched the buildings being destroyed, and behind them there was only a long open field where their lives could come to an end. Prigozhin already had 100 prisoners. The Ukrainians had suffered with the possibility of annihilation. When the Wagner group increased their attacks, the city was nearly surrounded. Their special forces saved the troops inside, and now they needed a new and desperate action to ensure their comrades' escape. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade was certain of the importance of their work. Taking control of Ivanovsk and the area ahead was crucial to keep the road to Chasiv Yar open and allow the elite troops to retreat from the city. Their armored vehicles showed up in force for the coordinated attack against the 374th Motorized Rifle Brigade and the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade of Russia. The two groups had replaced the mercenary troops who took the region and the Russian airborne forces who had gone on to support the fighting inside Bakhmut. The strategy was to maintain strong defensive positions in the rear and small groups on the front line to inflict casualties and delay the Ukrainians. The soldiers got out of the YPR 765S, compelled by the need to save their comrades. That force drove them en masse against the line of trees greened by spring, where the Russians were well hidden with their AMR camouflage. The suppressive fire from the men drove the Russians into their holes. The movements had to be careful, with the leaders demonstrating each step for the more eager or less experienced ones. Well hidden, the Russians waited for the right moment to take the life of a more eager soldier who advanced without covers. The wounded were dragged through the grass so that the advance could continue. The YPR 765 entered the woods, knocking down trees. The 25mm Oerlikon KBA-B02 cannon shattered the trees that spring had recovered after a harsh winter warmed by the bombings. The problem wasn't just the sea, but also the fortified hills where the Russians were hiding. As soon as the transport door opened, the men rushed out, laying down suppressive fire with the Kar-74S, a short weapon perfectly suited for fighting in the tight trenches. The sound of the AK-74 and the AK-105 also joined the battle. The Russians threw smoke grenades to contain the initial momentum and prepare for a possible retreat. The Ukrainian hill began to take shape. Ahead, the soldiers tried to climb the hill, experiencing up close the violence of the grenades exploding in the grass. They threw themselves to the ground, almost deafened, and ran across the greenish ground amid the white smoke, searching for the holes from which the Russians were firing. The hills were gradually taken. Surrounded, the opponents had to hide. Each bunker became a grave where soldiers were buried by uniformed grave diggers. The blasts echoed across the mounds of earth, sounding like a macabre tribute to the soldiers buried by explosions. The cost was high for the 3rd Assault Brigade, but the necessary positions were taken. The fighting did not end, but it was enough to allow the Ukrainian troops still in Bakhmut to withdraw. Under the desperation of the bombings, the men began to move down the street. Russian artillery rained down pieces of fury on those who tried to escape. Mercy didn't exist when the fire fell, searching for victims to feed the hatred of war. The soldier had no time to tremble, to make mistakes, or to pray, only to drive and hope that the Russians wouldn't be so accurate that day. Leaving Bakhmut was a relief in the heart of even the most experienced and courageous men. It was leaving hell and sparing your family from shedding tears for one more day. Inside, the Russians began their celebrations by raising their flags. Euphoria took over the ruins. Mercenaries laughed, thinking about the bonuses from their contracts and where they would go after that. Their leader had announced the withdrawal from the city, but no one knew the real game of the man who criticized Putin and dared to put up posters in his own honor in the Russian oblasts. From outside the trenches, the Ukrainians watched with relief at a job well done when they saw their brothers escape. Artillery would still fall on Russian Bakhmut-Artemovsk. The battles would continue on its flanks. The city was still not satisfied with the souls poured onto it or with the corpses it had embraced in its rubble. Only time would tell when the great concrete tomb would be satisfied.